You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. The Seattle City Council recently approved a $2 million loan for the city's social housing developer. That's a public development authority that will manage publicly financed housing in the city. It can serve people who make up to 120% of area median income. Voters overwhelmingly supported the creation of the social housing developer in 2023. They also approved a funding plan that pays for the developer by putting in place a new tax on high-income earners. Next year, the social housing developer is anticipated to receive $50 million from that tax. In the meantime, Mayor Bruce Harrell requested the $2 million loan, saying the money would go towards keeping the organization running and potentially acquiring new property this year. As of now, the developer doesn't own any. In its early stages, the public housing developer has been dogged by concerns that it hasn't proven it can get this money out the door and into housing, and questions about whether it's serving the city's greatest need by using public money to provide housing for people making more than the median income in the area. Roberto Jimenez is here to talk about all of that. He's the CEO of Seattle Social Housing Developer, and he's in studio with me. Thank you very much for being here, Roberto, and it's good to get to meet you.
All right. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start off just kind of with an introduction for folks. You know, you've been with the social housing developer for about a year.
10 months.
About 10 months. You were formerly the CEO of Mutual Housing California. That's a public-private affordable housing developer working in the Sacramento area. So having lived and reported in Los Angeles, I know that California has its own issues getting housing up and running. Mm-hmm. How does your experience in Sacramento kind of feed into what you're doing here in Seattle? How will that play a role here in the work in Seattle?
I started my career in rural Oregon in affordable housing.
You're from Oregon?
That's right. Right. I was raised in Portland or just outside of Portland. I was doing farm worker housing in the Mid-Willamette Valley for about 10 years. And then I decided I wanted to do something more urban. So I moved to California and started with Mutual Housing California. At the time, it was a mature 35-year-old or a nonprofit affordable housing developer that was one of the less productive developers in the state at that point, though they had a really beautiful portfolio. I was able to take that over and turn it around, and we became, within 5 years, one of the fifth most productive developers in the state, and ultimately number 3 shortly after I left.
And that means like you're opening the most new housing?
That's right. We're getting the most new dollars into affordable housing within the state. Yeah.
So when you were thinking about taking this role in Seattle, what were the opportunities and what were the challenges that you foresaw? And how is that, borne out by what you're seeing in practice?
I'm an optimistic person, and I understand the business of real estate, and I believe you can do it anywhere. It's a matter of where you're going to find the money to do it. That's become more and more challenging all over the country, but particularly in California, where labor costs are extremely high. And also the tax credit, the low-income housing tax credit, which is the primary source of funding for affordable housing, is oversubscribed dramatically. And so while we were very productive, we weren't actually able to make the kind of impact we wanted on homelessness. And that's because of the number of people falling into homelessness was exceeding the number of people who were actually living on the streets at that point. Mm. So if those folks had not been falling into homelessness, we would have actually made a very serious dent. Instead, we were able to make a smaller dent. I realized that something else was needed in order to have that impact.
Yeah, I just want to say, that is one of the frustrating things about reporting on homelessness in Washington, but also in other parts of the country. You can say we've housed this many people, right, but then the pipeline is still active and the problem continues to get worse or stays flat despite all that housing progress. But yeah, go ahead.
That's right. And that's because of the people falling into homelessness are increasingly at higher and higher area median incomes. And so what we're seeing here in Seattle, we saw in Sacramento, you saw in LA, and all the major cities, particularly on the West Coast, the population of people is growing on the streets, or displaced folks. And the model of social housing presents an opportunity to actually have deeper impact. So the affordable housing developers, I was one for 20 years, are really designed through the programs to serve those most in need. So those at, say, 50% of area median income or below. But what happens to the people above that? Well, that's what you see is working people in Seattle who are actually homeless. And that doesn't need to be the case. We can develop housing above 50% and allow the other public money, the other resources, to be focused on affordable housing and really try to make a bigger dent in the issues of affordable housing.
We've never seen a program like this at this scale in, what's going on in Seattle. People talk about like the Vienna model a lot. Did that worry you that Seattle was kind of doing something that had never been tested at this size before?
It excited me. Yeah, I had the opportunity to go to Vienna and study with 50 of my colleagues from California. So I spent a week there intensively studying social housing. And before I went, I wasn't wholly sold. I thought it was an interesting model. But after spending a week there talking to both practitioners and folks living in the housing, my mind changed completely. And I came back and quit my job in California and decided to move to Seattle. And many of my colleagues thought I was crazy.
Well, so let's get to the basics just for people who hear the term social housing. I mentioned before that this is mixed income. It serves people making 120% of area median income. So that's unique, compared to affordable housing, which is, designed for just lower income folks. This could, in Seattle, be an individual who makes around $120,000 a year, for example, who finds a spot in the social housing development. In the past, the business community, city council, they've raised questions about whether this is the best way to spend public dollars. Thinking about somebody, again, making six figures who would find a unit here. So why do you think this is a good model? And you mentioned you studied the Vienna project, and that it's extensively used in Vienna. Why do you think that this is a good model?
Well, to be clear on your last comment, we're serving folks from 0 to up to 120%. We've been running models and on actual properties, so we have a number of properties we're investigating and assessing, and we have not been needing to serve people above 95%. So mostly we are serving from about 45 to 95% in our modeling. And we think that will be doable, that will be feasible.
So while the social housing developer on paper, when voters were deciding on it, the idea was it could go up to 120%. Right now, what you're modeling is actually it's not going that high.
That's right.
Okay.
And also to be clear, we are designing units to serve populations at 120%. Those people are paying higher rents, and that subsidizes the lower.
They're not paying the same as somebody who's at 20% of area median.
That's exactly right. And that should, I would hope, take some pressure off of the system so those who were using public vouchers to pay for their housing. Right now there's too much pressure on that system, and those most in need of that can't get to it.
So a recent article in the Seattle Times by David Croman and Greg Kim really zeroed in on the problems that affordable housing developers are having right now in the city. I mean, it looked really bleak for them. You having experience with affordable housing, I'm sure you were, reading about this and learning more about this. A lot of affordable housing developers right now in Seattle are selling existing buildings because the maintenance costs are going up, rent recovery is down, building costs have also increased, which means there's more barriers to adding new affordable housing. And these are the units that are geared towards people earning less than 80% of area median income, so a slightly different model. How do you see the social housing developer being successful when affordable housing right now is struggling in Seattle? Or are there lessons you're learning from that?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot for the last decade as the problems become more challenging. The affordable housing developers are highly regulated, which is extremely expensive. And I'm not saying that public resources shouldn't be regulated. They should. But the cost of that is exorbitant. So that's one problem. And the housing doesn't support the cost. So the rental income off the housing doesn't support that cost. The affordable housing developer has to find that money elsewhere. So that's one of the challenges. Also, when rent collections drop, then the manager and owner of that housing have to make decisions about what they do with the scarce resources. They have to pay their mortgage, right? They have to pay for insurance. One of the only places that can ever be slightly cut is in maintenance. And so often deferred maintenance happens. And that's not the fault of the affordable housing developer. It's a resource problem. In our model, that shouldn't be the case because our model is not based on the rental incomes of the property, and our model is a cash basis for the cost of construction. And so we're basing our rents on the actual cost to construct and operate the building, whereas those affordable developers are having to base the rents under federal guidelines on area median incomes of people.
So you can actually base rents on the cost of doing business.
That's right.
Huh.
That's right. And as we pay down the mortgage on the building, assuming that all the other costs don't escalate too quickly, rents could actually drop.
Will that prevent you from serving more of the lower income folks in your system?
No, it'll actually make it easier. If the rents go down, then what we would do is be able to serve people at lower AMIs who can actually afford the rents.
Will there be like a shifting population then according to like when you're initially trying to pay down that mortgage? Is it, on the higher end of the income scale and then it drops over time, or will it continue to be diverse? Yeah.
It depends on what the rate of turnover is within these buildings. One of the things that I have seen happen over the last 20 years in urban areas is what my board members and I call the churn, the turnover within a property, whether that's an affordable property or a market rate property. People come and they go, and they don't stay for long periods of time. And what I, as a community developer, right, that's my background. I use real estate to build community. What I'd like to see is more stability within neighborhoods where people are not coming and going so quickly, where they know their neighbors, where they walk their streets, where they shop at their local businesses. People know each other. And that has all kinds of positive social impacts, but not the least of those is on people's physical and mental health.
So next year is when the funding pipeline from this new tax is going to start. And there's an estimated $50 million coming to the social housing developer from the voter-approved payroll tax. This is on companies that compensate individuals over $1 million. So right now you have this loan. What's going to be the focus of the loan? And then what happens when that $50 million comes through? So
we don't know that it will be $50 million. Those estimates didn't come from the city. They were done by some enterprising people who were working with How's Our Neighbors. And they could be quite accurate, but we haven't been able to verify those.
Those are campaign numbers, basically.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And the city will have more solid estimates sometime in August. So then we'll know what we're actually facing. And so it's been pretty challenging to try to figure out what can we do when we don't have any idea really what amount of money we're going to have. And we can't go get loans saying we have $50 million because we can't verify that we're going to have $50 million. So that's part of what's slowed things down. The $2 million is to keep the doors open through the end of the year. And so far, over the last 10 months, I've been the only staff person. We have a really committed board of directors who have been putting in a lot of hours of volunteer time to make this enterprise launch. And we're reaching the point where if we don't start to hire some staff, it will delay us in achieving our goals under our strategic plan into next year. And we don't want to wait. We'd like to get a jump start on that.
So you were on staff, the one staff member, while this whole campaign over the funding model was going on, and you were, watching that. I assume because you were an employee, you couldn't really participate in the campaign.
That's correct.
Yeah. So it was sort of like you were on the sidelines and you're watching what shook out to be the city council and the mayor, and then advocates kind of on different sides of how the organization should be funded. The mayor and the city council wanted a plan that would have directed money from the Jumpstart tax, a lot less than, what the final funding model ended up being. And it also would have had more oversight over the public housing developer, lower income requirements for housing. And that was kind of like seen as the training wheels version of the public housing developer. And instead, voters endorsed a much broader, the new tax, a much higher funding level. Voters really endorsed this idea of social housing. When you were watching this idea of training wheels, what were your thoughts that, the idea that the city council and the mayor were kind of saying, we're not so sure about this. We need to, kind of do some baby steps before we open up to this idea?
I understand that it's challenging, and I understand there's some history here with the council and another housing authority that was challenged. I don't know much of the details there, but to me it seemed like folks were nervous, and probably rightly so. But I think that real estate takes risk, and I'm able to manage that risk. And I feel like the risks here are worth taking, and I think it can be solid and productive and beneficial to the city.
How much of a difference does it make that the voters did add this tax, say, okay, maybe it's not 50 million, but whatever it ends up being, the estimate, it's much higher than the 10 million that the council and the mayor wanted. How much of a difference will that make, do you think, in practice in Seattle?
I mean, it's a critical difference. The 10 million would have been capital to develop housing. It wouldn't have given us operating funds. And so we would have nowhere to get those funds, which is not to say that it was impossible. That's frankly how the affordable housing developers work. But because they do it that way, they layer in a higher developer fee than we will have to. Right. And that is so that they can keep their doors open and keep staffed so they can do their good work. We won't be facing that because of this initiative. We will have ongoing permanent funds to support staffing to keep the agency whole. And I think that will benefit the housing itself and the people who live there.
So we've talked a little bit about some external questions that were coming during that campaign. I want to ask you about some internal struggles that we've seen so far. That the Social Housing Developer Board has 13 members. Earlier this year, 2 members of the board resigned, and they accused you of, quote, abuse, anti-Black racism, and bigotry. The remaining board members approved hiring an outside investigator to look at the complaints, and that's, I'm assuming, happening. It doesn't help the image right now of the developer getting off the ground, right, to have that board sort of revolt or partial board revolt. What do you say to people who are concerned about that?
Well, I say that the issues at hand are an internal HR matter that I can't speak to, and I won't speak on behalf of those who departed. But there's been turnover at the board, and that's not surprising. This is a startup enterprise, and what it takes to launch a young enterprise like this in its first couple of years is quite different than what it takes to get it off the ground and really running as a real estate development agency. So turnover is expected. Board members have been putting in a lot of hours. There's the risk of burnout. I think some burnout has happened, and that's part of the turnover that has occurred. And that's why the $2 million is so important here, so that we can bring in staff to start doing the work that staff need to do, so board members are not burdened with that. And also, I think that it's appropriate that it's the time for the board itself to move into more of a governance oversight role, a fiduciary role. And that's healthy and beneficial to the entity. And I think that's addressing the concern that council members and the mayor have had. So I want a really solid agency. And I've recruited several people to potentially be board members, and several of them have said, this sounds like a lot of work. And I and my board members say, it is. It's work worth doing, but you have to have the time, right? You can't come in and not have the appropriate time right now. So I think we're at a solid place. The most recent appointment by the mayor, this person, Brian Abeal, took the treasurer role on our board recently and brings in a really high level of financial knowledge and experience. And I think, again, that addresses a lot of the concerns that I heard people expressing leading up to the vote in February.
So how close are you right now? You mentioned there's an unpredictability element with not knowing what the actual receipts from the new tax will be. How close are you right now to acquiring a new building or buildings or actually, thinking about construction starts?
Yeah. So the bulk of the work we will be doing initially will be acquisitions, and that's quite intentional. Right now we can acquire property, newer properties, which are in very good condition, market rate properties, and flip them into permanently affordable housing. For about one of them is half the price of what new construction would cost. So I think that's what we should expect to see. We are currently analyzing 4 different properties in very different parts of the city. One of those would be new construction, but new construction is also going to take longer, and we really need to deliver soon. Our strategic plan was adopted by the full board unanimously in May, and that calls for having 1 new property under contract by the end of the year, and we're on schedule to do that, and then 2 properties next year.
Any hints as to what type of property you're eyeballing or any more information?
I think you and I would be very happy to live in the properties that we're talking about. One is in South Seattle, and one is closer to downtown. They're large properties, so 175 to 300 units of housing, so substantial properties. And they were developed as market rate properties, and so one of them was actually designed as a luxury property. It's a beautiful building, and the cost on that one is very, very affordable.
So what's your vision for the next 5 years? If we're thinking about 1 building by the end of this year, 2 next year, what's your vision in 5 years?
I would say, we continue kind of at that rate of, 300 plus new units a year. I think that's easily doable. And I would hope that by year 5, we would be into new construction. That's our goal. We can design the type of housing that fits in the context of communities. We can build at different scales in various places where different types of properties are needed and allowable under zoning. When we build these new units, we can build to passive house, and that will be beneficial to the environment and to the health and pocketbooks of those who live in the housing, as well as the social housing developer.
Before we go, anything you want people to know, especially folks who maybe in the city of Seattle were skeptical during this last vote and, maybe didn't endorse the social housing developer? Anything you want to say as a final thought?
I would say I really enjoyed talking to people leading up to February. I don't expect that everybody's going to agree with me, but I really enjoy having the conversation and hearing what they're concerned about. And I think I was able to change a few people's minds about what the levels of risk here are. And I would say that the council and mayor's office have been incredibly supportive. And that's a big shift. And we want their confidence. And we want to be a good partner here in the city, both serving those in need and working in partnership with the city itself and with business in the city. And it looks very hopeful to me.
Roberto Jimenez is the CEO of Seattle's social housing developer. Really appreciate you coming in today. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Libby.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.